Darkness envelops a desolate room where a lone figure stands, its face obscured by a grotesque look adorned with a twisted grin. Its unsettling presence forces victims to confront their deepest fears and inner demons. With each step, this entity preys on unsuspecting souls who dare to enter its domain. Brace yourself for a journey into terror as the line between reality and nightmare blurs, and the true horror of Smile is unleashed upon those who dare to face it. The film starts in the bedroom, with a woman lying dead in her bed from a drug overdose. The camera then pans to a family picture on her dresser, showing us that she was a single mother with 2 daughters, until, at last, we see her youngest daughter, Rose, standing at the door with a distressed look. We then skip to years in the future, where Rose is now an adult who works as a psychiatrist at a mental hospital. That day, she enters a session with one of the hospital's longtime residents, Carl. Carl is having a manic episode and repeatedly murmurs that he's going to die. During their conversation, Rose patiently tries to comfort him, but Carl continues with his episode. Rose is so passionate about helping these mentally unstable people that she hasn't come home since her late shift last night. But just as she's about to go home later, she receives a phone call informing her of the arrival of a new patient, Laura, who needs immediate assistance. According to the patient files, Laura seems to have lost her mind ever since she watched her university professor bludgeon himself to death with a hammer on campus just last week. And so, Rose agrees to meet with her. Laura appears to be heavily distressed, but Rose manages to convince her to come sit in front of her. Here, Laura insists that she's not crazy, but she is being followed by an entity that no one else can see. The figure is able to disguise itself as anyone, sometimes taking the form of someone she knows, and other times a stranger. What distinguishes the figure from normal people is that it would smile widely at her, but not a friendly smile. To make it even worse, the figure told her that she's going to die today. Hearing this, Rose thinks it's nothing but her hallucination, and tries to explain to her that when we go through severe trauma, sometimes our minds tend to see things. Laura seems to be frustrated by her words. All of a sudden, Laura starts screaming and begins dragging herself to the edge of the room, all the while announcing that the entity is now here with them. The concerned Rose immediately reaches for the phone and calls the emergency unit. However, when Rose turns around, Laura is now standing before her, smiling lewdly while holding a shard from the broken vase. Up next, she begins slashing her own throat, while Rose freezes and watches. The hospital's emergency unit storms in right after, but it is too late. Later on, a couple of detectives show up at the scene to question Rose about the incident, one of whom happens to be Rose's ex-boyfriend, Joel. The shaken Rose explains to them that Laura was delusional and describes how she was smiling when she killed herself. After the traumatic event at work, she finally heads home. In the evening, she downs some wine in an attempt to calm herself down, right when she suddenly notices a creepy sight of Laura standing in the corner of the room, smiling at her. She then gets interrupted by her fiancé, Trevor, who just came home from work. After she told him what happened at work, she watched how Laura was no longer standing at the corner, so she brushed it off as her hallucination. That night, the couple goes out for dinner with Rose's pretentious sister Holly and her husband Greg. Due to her apparent trauma from Laura's suicide, Rose doesn't seem to be listening to what they say. Rose also gets defensive when Holly and her husband casually suggest that they should sell Rose and Holly's childhood home to make some extra bucks. After dinner, Rose ends the night by feeding her fluffy cat, Mustache. The following day, she forces herself to go to work despite feeling distraught. Out of curiosity, she heads to the front desk and asks for the case report of the professor who killed himself in front of Laura. This is when her ex-boyfriend Joel suddenly pops in, having come to check on how she's doing after what happened yesterday. After insisting she's fine and telling him to leave, she retreats to her office to study the case report about the professor, whose name was Gabriel Munoz. Soon after, Holly calls to apologize for their previous argument and tell Rose about her son's upcoming birthday. While they talk, she notices a figure who looks like Laura in the distance, standing in front of the hospital, but she still tries to brush it off. She resumes her day until she notices her patient Carl smiling lewdly inside his room. Sensing something's wrong, she goes to check on him. However, he is seen with a disturbing smile, like Laura, and begins to repeatedly tell Rose that she's going to die. Carl suddenly stands up while menacingly yelling the same words, prompting her to call the nurses for help to apprehend Carl, who apparently was lying on his bed the entire time. This causes her boss to summon her to ask what's up because Carl has been a patient for a long time and yet has never exhibited violent behavior. He assumes that Rose must have misinterpreted Carl's gesture because she's traumatized by the suicide yesterday. Therefore, he decides to give her a week off to recuperate. Later that night, Rose is still home alone when the house alarm starts blaring. Scared, she arms herself with a pair of scissors and heads for the front door, only to find it still locked. However, her back door is open. She then gets a phone call from a home security operator, checking if she's okay. But weirdly, the caller then tells her to look behind her, which confuses Rose. What makes it even weirder is that the phone rings again, and Rose realizes that she's not holding a phone this entire time. Once again, she reaches out to pick up the call, and luckily this time, it's from an actual operator. A couple of officers were dispatched to check the premises, but they found nothing out of the ordinary. Her fiancé Trevor arrives just as the officers leave, worrying if she's okay, but she yet again assures him she's fine. To add to Rose's anxiety that night, she can't seem to find her cat, Mustache. Later that night, Rose has trouble sleeping and resorts to listening to the recording of the session she had with Laura. Right after Laura starts screaming, Rose hears a faint whisper in the recording. But when she raises the volume and listens to it again, she hears her name in it. Seeing the figure shocks Rose, so she arms herself with a knife, but the figure has disappeared. Trevor comes to her aid, and she is freaked out by her current state. This is when Rose begins to question her sanity, so she goes to see her therapist, Madeline. The therapist assesses that Rose isn't delusional, but simply reliving her unhealed childhood trauma from witnessing her mother die of an overdose. With that, Rose tries to move on with her life and goes to attend her niece's birthday party. A few hours in, they get to the gift unwrapping session, and it is now time to unwrap the gift Rose brought. But to the kid's horror, instead of a toy train, he finds Mustache's dead body inside the box. Rose immediately cries in horror and cradles her dead cat, all the while trying to convince everyone that she didn't do this. And in the midst of it all, she sees one of the guests appear to have the entity's evil smile that is invisible to others. This causes her to stagger backward and land on top of a glass table, injuring herself. She is rushed to the ER for medical attention, and she gets driven home by Trevor afterwards. Once they arrive, she tries to tell him about the entity that she's convinced is following her, but her fiancé doesn't believe her, and starts saying that perhaps Rose is mentally ill, just like her mom was. That night, she continues her research on Laura's professor, Gabriel Munoz, until she hears her mother's voice calling her name. She then forces herself to sleep, while the figure now takes the shape of her mother in the background. On the next day, she pretends to be a reporter and visits Gabriel Munoz's wife to ask about her husband's death. Mrs. Munoz shows her the drawings that Gabriel drew and collected shortly before his death, all of which depicted faces with disturbing smiles. Interestingly enough, apparently Gabriel started acting weird after witnessing a woman kill herself. After hearing this, Rose claims that she is experiencing what Gabriel did, but Victoria thinks that Rose is mocking her tragedy, so she kicks her out of the house. Desperate, she decides to go to her ex, Joel, and begs him to help her find the person who killed herself in front of Gabriel Munoz in the police database. After finding the woman's name, she has a theory in mind, so she asks Joel to trace whether or not the woman witnessed someone kill themselves too, and just so happens, the woman did. The two sit and watch security footage of a man walking up to the woman and killing himself with a pair of hedge shears. Upon further inspection, they also noticed that the man was smiling, just like Laura did before she killed herself. Rose goes on to print all this evidence and is about to present it to her fiancé. However, when she gets home, she finds that he's brought her therapist there, cementing how he thinks she's unwell and would never believe her. Rose yells at Trevor, saying that he is more concerned with how she is going to make him look, prompting her to storm out. Feeling betrayed, she then goes to her sister Holly, but Holly doesn't believe her either. Instead, Holly thinks that Rose sounds like their mom, and the two start rehashing about their traumatic childhood, where at some point Holly moved away and left little Rose alone with their abusive mom. The argument ends with Holly coldly retreating inside the house and Rose walking back to her car in defeat. But it appears there might be a little hope left, as Holly comes back outside and walks towards the car. But psych, it's not actually Holly. Later that night, Rose receives a call from her ex, Joel, informing her that he has discovered a pattern of 20 different suicide witnesses and 19 suicides with a direct line linking them all together. Apparently, somewhere along the line, one man named Robert Talley witnessed a suicide, and then he went out to kill someone else, and Robert is still alive today. Fascinatingly, the key witness to this murder committed suicide a week later, and the cycle continued. And so Joel agrees to drive Rose to see Robert Talley in prison, and on the way, she tells him everything that's been happening. Unlike everyone else, Joel believes her. He also tells her that none of these victims lasted more than a week, which increases Rose's fear, as today is her 4th day. Rose finally gets an audience with Robert Talley and asks him how he could possibly survive. According to him, the only way is by killing someone in front of another person. This way, you're passing on the curse to the person who witnesses the murder. Rose freaks out about the idea of murdering someone, and when Rose tells him that she cannot kill anyone, Robert freaks out. He thinks that Rose brought the entity with her, forcing him to be restrained. Rose ponders about it as Joel drives her home. She continues to study the case files and tries to look for other options but doesn't find any. And then all of a sudden, her therapist shows up at her door, voicing her worry for Rose's mental health, so Rose lets her in. Just as they're about to discuss Rose's condition, the phone rings, and Rose goes to answer. Surprisingly, it is her therapist calling her, saying she's worried, which means that the person in front of her isn't her actual therapist. It is now that the entity reveals itself by smiling, while telling her that her time is running out. Rose starts backing up, while the entity rises and steps closer to tease her before disappearing. Our protagonist is now desperate. She hides a knife in her sleeve and proceeds to enter the mental hospital, headed straight for Carl's room. He understandably starts freaking out when she enters and starts screaming. Hearing the scream, Rose's boss enters the scene and confusedly asks Rose what's going on. This is where Rose goes crazy and pulls out the knife to repeatedly stab Carl, but over time, he oddly starts smiling, while her boss suddenly tears his face off, revealing all that was yet another hallucination. As she yells in frustration, her boss shows up, asking her what she's doing here, and tries convincing her to come in and talk, but she insists that she must be alone. Right after she says this, she sees a vision of a bloody Carl, so she starts driving away in panic. Rose realizes that what this entity wants is for Rose to kill herself in front of someone else to pass on the curse. So the solution to all this would be to completely isolate herself. She heads to her childhood home while a worried Joel calls her on the way, as Rose's boss alerts the police about how Rose is a danger to herself at the moment. She assures Joel that this is the only way to stop this and asks him not to come after her. For the first time in so many years, Rose returns home to face her trauma. As she approaches her mother's room, she gets a memory flashback of her mom dying from a drug overdose and begging for Rose to call 911. But little Rose didn't do it because the mom was abusive, and Rose was too scared of her. In the present, Rose shuts all the windows and exits and lights a lantern to help her see. When night falls, she starts hearing the sound of her mother crying from the bedroom, but this time she's not afraid. She walks up to the bedroom and finds her mother crying in her room. Rose goes on and says that she no longer wants to drown in guilt for letting her mother die because her mother was a monster and abusive. Rose should therefore forgive herself and no longer let this trauma be used to haunt or scare her. She ends her statement by saying that what she's looking at right now isn't real, prompting the entity to start smiling. As Rose fearfully exits the room, it holds the door and reveals its true form, which morphs into a tall, deformed version of Rose's mother. Rose keeps backing up and finds her way to the living room, while the entity suddenly appears behind her and throws her across the room. The creature pins her down, but Rose is no longer afraid. The creature is in Rose's mind, so as long as she's not afraid, she could take charge. She manages to break its arm and smash the lantern at it, instantly burning the creature down. At last, she walks out and watches the house burn down. She returns to the city in the morning and visits Joel to say sorry for ruining their relationship by being distant because of her unhealed childhood trauma. And now, she's asking if she can stay here and just sleep. But then Joel starts smiling, saying that she can stay with him forever. Scared, Rose exits the apartment as the entity runs towards her and gets transported back to her childhood home. At the same time, the actual Joel just arrived, trying to approach her because he's worried for her. Afraid for his safety, Rose retreats and locks the door, while Joel struggles to break through it. Meanwhile, inside the house, the creature crawls out and rips its own skin off. It also appears to have full control of Rose now. Rose sinks to her knees while the creature opens her mouth, disturbingly forcing itself into her body. When Joel finally makes it inside the house, he eventually finds Rose soaked in lamp oil, but unfortunately, it is too late. She turns around with a lewd smile. Before the film ends, she lights up a match and burns herself to death, while Joel W. Ches, the film ends here.